We do not rule out that during these negotiations it may be possible to agree on some new ceasefires, on a new cessation of hostilities. And we're talking about a real ceasefire, one that would be observed not only by Russia but also by the Ukrainian side. Who needs such a peace?
Well, the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, finally delivered his explosive speech in the middle of the night between May 10th and 11th, as Dmitry Peskov said, and commented on the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. In short, Putin proposed to resume direct negotiations without preconditions between Russia and Ukraine as early as next Thursday, May 15th in Istanbul. Tomorrow, Putin will hold a dialogue with the president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, regarding providing a venue for the talks. But this venue has already been provided for a long time. Putin also stated that Russia has informed its colleagues in the West that Moscow may extend the ceasefire announced on May 9th in the future. Putin also officially admitted that North Korean troops participated in the war against Ukraine. Well, in addition, Putin accused Ukraine of violating the moratorium on strikes against energy facilities and the ceasefire. Well, based on these statements, Putin rejects the proposal from the coalition of interested parties for a 30-day ceasefire, which was supposed to begin on May 12th. My name is Alexei Pechi. It's late at night, transitioning from May 10th to the 11th. Let's briefly figure out together what exactly the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has told us. I will go through in chronological order what he announced there. Then Putin began by praising how many guests he had at the May 9th parade, especially noting the participation of the Chinese leader Xi Jinping in the parade. He says this is the most important guest. He talked a lot about how everyone who was at the parade are allies for, quote, building a new world and the entire global community. Well, he says, these are the real allies, these are the ones who truly see how to change this world, not like those in the West. He noted that all the negotiations were precisely about how to build a new world. What is meant are the negotiations of the Russian dictator Putin with all those guests who were at the parade. According to Putin, there were more than 20 meetings with the heads of the Commonwealth of independent states countries, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, and so on. Putin also boasted about the number of guests at the May 9th parade. He said there were a total of 27 heads of state and 9 leaders of international organizations. However, then there was some confusion because he said 27 heads of state, but 6 countries were represented at a high level. Well, here there's a bit of a discrepancy. In addition, according to Putin, 13 countries sent troops to the parade who marched on Red Square. And as Putin stated, this is a genuine unification around victory and new ideas of world order. He especially noted the troops from North Korea who fought alongside Russians for, as Putin says, the liberation of the Kursk region. He highlighted their heroism, saying they are true heroes. Well, if it weren't for the North Korean troops, I don't know how we would have gotten out of that situation at all. Then Putin stated that despite all the threats, the closure of airspace and all sorts of obstacles, Serbia, Slovakia and Bosnia and Herzegovina still sent their representatives to Moscow. Well, separately, he mentioned Fico and Vučić, that is, the leaders of Slovakia and Serbia. We're talking about the countries of the Baltic region. They essentially closed their airspace to planes flying to Moscow. Next, Putin stated that he strongly believes that the restoration of relations with all European countries will begin. Even those who are currently against Russia, who are Russophobes and so on. According to Putin, Europe speaks to the Kremlin in a rude and ultimatum-like manner and says that there is no need to talk to us like that at all. Then Putin noted that Xi Jinping was the main guest of this parade. A big hello to everyone else who showed up at this parade on May 9th. So you weren't the main ones, all the rest of you are just some guests. The main guest is Xi Jinping. He says they had fruitful negotiations with him. There were 2 joint statements, a huge number of agreements on energy, the defense industry, trade, finance, science, and so on and so on. It was announced that in September, Putin will fly to China for the occasion of China's victory over Japan. Well, and then that's how it is. It's obvious how Putin is now rewriting history, saying that it's symbolic that all the parades celebrating the victory in World War II are held in Russia and China. So this is now the new history that, according to Putin, we need to take into account. What is meant is that there was a parade in Moscow on May 9th, and now in September there will be one in Beijing, and Putin will go there. Well, after all that, he finally moved on to the current issue regarding Russia's war against Ukraine. And then Putin started talking about how Russia has always been the first to come up with initiatives for a ceasefire, while Ukraine has constantly sabotaged all these proposals. Let me note right away that back in March, at the beginning of March, the United States of America proposed the idea of a 30-day unconditional complete ceasefire. As they say, on land, at sea, and in the air. But Putin says, no, we were the ones who proposed it and Ukraine refused. According to Putin, Ukraine violated the moratorium on strikes against energy facilities 130 times. Putin claims that the energy truce was violated 130 times and the Easter truce was not observed. With Ukraine violating it 5,000 times, he says Russia declared the truce for the third time. They passed this idea on to their colleagues in the West, saying that this truce, which Putin declared for May 9th, could possibly be extended. And supposedly this whole idea, which was voiced today in Kiev about a 30-day truce starting from May 12th, is all nonsense. Well, actually, this is Putin, in case you didn't know. He told his Western colleagues, as he puts it, that he was announcing a 3-day truce, and then, if anything, he would extend it for some incredible period. Then he goes on to say that, well, despite everything, he believes that the West truly wants peace. And he says there are people in the West who want this peace. And then comes the most interesting part. Putin allegedly promised to extend the truce after 3 days of ceasefire right up to May 9th. According to him, the Kyiv authorities did not respond at all to the proposal for a ceasefire. Moreover, as Putin claims after May 5th, when he first voiced this idea of a truce, the Kyiv authorities launched large-scale attacks from May 6th to 7th. 524 drones flew over Russia, a number of Western-made missiles, and there were also 45 unmanned boats in the Black Sea launched by Ukraine. Of course, the Russians bravely repelled all of this, but according to Putin, this shows that Kyiv does not want peace. Kyiv disrupts any truce that he proposes. Regarding these 3 days of truce, May 8th, 9th, and 10th, Putin says that during this period there were 5 targeted attempts to attack the border in Kursk and Belgorod regions by the armed forces of Ukraine. In other directions there were 36 attacks. And, according to Putin, these attacks were carried out exclusively for political reasons. The enemy suffered very heavy losses. Next, Putin states that Kyiv not only rejected the proposal for a 3-day ceasefire, but also intimidated the leaders of the states in Moscow at the parade. He claims they deliberately tried to scare people away from flying to them, but people still came anyway. And next, I will give you a direct quote from the dictator Putin. This is the only quote in which you will see his face in this episode. He says those who tried to be intimidated among those who came to Moscow, these are the real leaders. And in Kyiv, there are some Nazi collaborators who tried to intimidate us, but they didn't succeed.
Those who tried to be intimidated among those who came to Moscow. At the celebration of the victory over Nazi Germany, who were they trying to intimidate? After all, those who came to us are leaders not because of their official position, not because of their title, but because of their character, their beliefs, and their willingness to stand up for their convictions. And who tried to intimidate them? Those who stand at attention and salute and applaud former SS soldiers and elevate to the rank of national heroes those who collaborated with Hitler during World War II. But it seems to me that this is an attempt with clearly unfit means. And those who are trying to do this do not correspond to the scale of the undertaking they themselves are counting on.
Well, and then Putin finally got to the main point. He says that Russia has never refused dialogue with Ukraine. And he says, quote, no, we broke off negotiations in 2022. As Putin stated, Moscow is proposing to Kyiv to resume negotiations in the format of 2022, which were conducted at the beginning of the full-scale war. These should be exclusively direct negotiations without preconditions, without delay, and further. Putin states that these negotiations should take place on May 15th, Thursday, in Istanbul. As he says, where they were put on pause, that's where they should resume. Right from the point where they stopped back then. Erdogan will take on the role of mediator. And as Putin says, the project was initialed by Kyiv in 2022, but was thrown into the trash. And now Putin says it needs to be taken out of the trash. Here is the very agreement project that was supposedly initialed in the spring of 2022, and as if to dust it off and start negotiations from the point where they stopped. There are, however, questions regarding the 4 regions of Ukraine that Putin now claims. How he plans to include them there. Well, if we follow Putin's logic, then we return to the point in negotiations that was stopped in the spring of 2022. Back then, there were no statements from the Kremlin claiming that they had supposedly included 4 regions of Ukraine in their constitution, regions that they hadn't even fully occupied. Now, this is an interesting point. And then Putin stated that as soon as tomorrow, that is on May 11th, he would talk with Recep Tayyip Erdogan and ask to hold negotiations in Turkey on May 15th. He says Moscow is set for serious negotiations. It's interesting to note that, as I recall, there were leaks and insider reports the day before that Donald Trump actually asked Recep Tayyip Erdogan to take on the role of mediator in the negotiations. And then suddenly Putin, starts playing with words, saying, well, I'll call Erdogan and ask him to provide us with a venue in Istanbul. If that's possible, of course, so that we could start direct negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. He then immediately specifies the date as May 15th in Istanbul. That is, I assume that these agreements had already been outlined long ago. And now Putin is voicing them. Putin discusses the conditions for negotiations, stating they are unconditional but still mentioning certain requirements. He says the conflict's root causes must be eliminated. Do you remember all that nonsense about Ukraine not joining NATO, denazification, demilitarization, and so on? Then he says that maybe at these direct negotiations in Istanbul it will be possible to agree on a ceasefire and a truce. That would be the first step toward long-term peace, says Putin, not the rearmament of the armed forces of Ukraine and the frantic construction of strongholds and digging of trenches. Well, that's it. So, in this way, Putin is saying that he rejects this proposal for a ceasefire starting from May 12th and instead suggests let's meet in Istanbul on May 15th and try to negotiate some kind of long-term ceasefire there. He says we need a long-term peace, as he puts it, for centuries, really. So, as Putin says, our proposal is on the table, the decision is up to Kyiv and their supervisors. The West wants to continue the war with Russia using Ukrainian nationalists, while Russia is ready for negotiations unconditionally. But, I don't know. It seems that Russians perceive this calmly when Putin in one sentence says, we are ready to resume negotiations unconditionally, but here are a number of conditions for you. Well, I don't know, maybe it's just ignorance, and they don't understand that this absolutely contradicts itself. Well, and Putin once again repeated that they are proposing to resume the negotiations that were interrupted in 2022. That is, exactly from that point directly, without intermediaries, Ukraine and Russia sit down at the negotiating table and since the 15th of May have been trying to at least agree on a ceasefire. And finally, he thanked for the mediation in the search for peace in the war of Russia against Ukraine. China, Brazil, African countries, Middle Eastern countries, and the new administration of the President of the United States of America. Interestingly, in this address, Putin never once used the name and surname of Donald Trump, but simply says our colleagues over there, the United States administration, and nothing more. Overall, it looks like Putin has indeed secured a certain level of support from Xi Jinping, and that's why he is now proposing to conduct negotiations in this way. It's obvious that he is now rejecting a ceasefire starting from May 12th. And here's an interesting point. In fact, Ukraine, Europe, and the United States made their move, and everyone was waiting to see what move Putin would make. Here he announced it. I will not agree to a ceasefire on your terms, but I am ready on the 15th of May to sit down at the negotiating table in Istanbul and start negotiating about something. Now it's interesting to see how Donald Trump will behave. He and his administration recently stated that Putin is clearly prolonging the entire negotiation process because he doesn't want to look for real ways out of this war. And now I suppose that in the Trump administration, instead of imposing tough sanctions on Moscow already on Monday, May 12th, they will say no. Well, look, on the 15th of May, they proposed some kind of negotiations to try to agree on a ceasefire. So they'll start dragging out this whole story again. Although I don't rule out that Europe will now push its line and say, look, our proposal was for May 12th, the start of negotiations, the beginning of a ceasefire, and then accordingly, within 30 days, an attempt to find a format for negotiations. You are refusing this ceasefire, so here's a huge package of sanctions for you. Well, then we'll see what happens next, whether we'll meet with you on May 15th in Istanbul or not. So in general, there was nothing explosive about it, except for the fact that Putin stated, "Budu, we are ready for negotiations, direct negotiations with Ukraine, and these negotiations should be based on where we left off in the spring of 2022. In general, write your opinion about this explosive speech in the comments. As Peskov stated the day before, he said that American television would simply explode from this news, which is being announced. Putin, this will be something incredible. Well, I didn't hear anything incredible, nothing new was said here either, but still, maybe I missed something. Be sure to write in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, click the bell, and don't forget to like.